Chapter 22. The Prince of Oxen. There was something eerily beautiful about all of the children, a physical trait that seemed to come directly from the Empress herself. It was an ethereal quality that marked them out as different and, as the children were instructed, special. But it was Ramael who was the epitome of this trait. The moment he removed his helm, the dark night seemed to shine with reflected glory. The prince saw Leah's knees go slightly weak before she caught herself, and a number of the kindred, including Tamaz, took an involuntary step forward as if to bow in deference. Ramael's face was framed with golden waves of thick, luxurious hair that shone like the sun even in the night, with an insistent and hypnotizing luminescence. Perfectly sized, almond-shaped eyes, the blue-gray color of ice, framed a sharp nose that led to sculpted brows and high, sharp cheekbones over a wide, strong jaw, all of which gave an air of such masculinity that no other man in the world could ever be considered more than a boy. Ramael was the perfect physical being, made so by over 140 years wearing the ox talisman. He was stronger and faster than any man alive, and had been so upon reaching adulthood. But beneath it all, the Prince of Ravens could sense blood and hate, as he always did. The Prince of Oxen's life was an inferno of burning metal, and from him emanated a sense of murderous heat, like coals set to the leaves of a dry forest. The Prince of Ravens stepped forward, knowing how small and insignificant he looked in front of his brother, the same way he'd always looked. "Ramael," he said quietly. "I'm amazed to find you here," the Prince of Oxen said, smiling to reveal a row of perfect white teeth that had never needed to be scrubbed clean. Even his voice was beautiful, a deep, vibrating bass that penetrated pleasurably to the core of your body. "But then again, I'm not." "Go away, Ramael," the prince said, unable to help comparing his voice to his brother's. A few of the kindred shifted behind him, though, as if his contradiction had helped them break free of the Ox-Lord's spell. Ramael growled low in his throat, and his face turned ugly, lips pulling back from his teeth in an animalistic snarl. The blue-gray eyes grew even colder. "Oh, I'm sorry," the prince said loudly, his own lips lifting but in contempt. "I forgot. You don't like people challenging you." "Mother isn't here to save you from me now," Ramael said, the anger cooling quickly everywhere but in his eyes. "I would watch what you say to me. No Joffred here to convince me it's better not to teach you a lesson." "Watch what I say," the prince asked. "Does that mean you'll leave if I ask nicely?" The Prince of Oxen chuckled darkly. The Prince of Ravens felt his teeth clench automatically, but he took a deep breath and another step forward. "Ramael," he said, "you don't have to do this." He motioned to the exiled kindred soldiers behind him. "These are good people," he said, forsaking his pride and speaking from his heart. "They have law and order in their cities. They raise their children well, and they would be good citizens of the Empire if only Mother would allow them back." There was another stir behind the prince, this one rebellious. He knew that many of the kindred, Leah and Tamaz included, would never go back to the Empire, no matter what the Empress offered. But he continued on heedlessly. He knew that if the Prince of Oxen attacked, they stood no chance of survival. He had to try everything. "Please, brother, they have things they can teach even us. They can add to the Empire's greatness. They can come back. They are good people. They would be good citizens. If you and I both go to Mother and tell her that—" "Mother didn't even allow you to keep your name," the Prince of Oxen said, enjoying every word. "Why do you think she would allow you in her presence?" The prince fell silent, and despite his resolve, he felt his breath catch in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak again, trying to find something to say, but Ramael cut him off by raising his helm to his head. Fear spiked in the prince. He took another step forward, holding out his hands. Several kindred drew in sharp breaths. He was now within range of his brother's axes if the Ox-Lord chose to swing them. "Please, brother," he said, "you don't need to do this." Ramael stared at him for a long time, face stony and blank, and then slowly, his upper lip pulled back in contempt. "I would say it shames me to see one of the children beg. But then again, you are not one of us. You are a dog who ran instead of facing his fate. You are a mistake. The first that Mother has made, perhaps, in a long time, but one she is striving to correct. And I am here to take back what has always belonged to the Empire, like a good son, a true child. At that moment, a number of things happened simultaneously. Ramael pulled his helm back onto his head and unlimbered his axes. A shout rang out from behind the prince, and an enormous form pushed him out of the way. Arrows released from taut bowstrings on both sides, and the earth demon charged forward, lifting a heavy, spiked iron club. The prince, knocked to the ground, looked up, and to his horror saw Thomas, armor in tatters, greatsword in hand, engage Ramael. Any other vision was obscured by a haze of arrows so thick that the prince was forced to press his head to the ground and pray he wouldn't be hit. When he looked up again, it was to see the tree-trunk foot of the demon descending toward his head. He rolled out of the way just in time and made it back to his feet. The demon caught sight of him and swung its club. It took all of the prince's speed to dodge out of the way, away from Ramael and Thomas. He ran back, but the demon stayed on him, swinging the mace and killing 2 kindred soldiers who got in the way. And then Leah was there, springing past the prince and straight at the demon, her daggers drawn. She landed on the demon's arm, and it tried to shake her loose, but with an amazing display of acrobatic dexterity, she not only clung to it, but climbed up the arm and onto the creature's back, directly behind the blood mage controlling it. "No!" the prince yelled at her, but it was too late. The dagger swung down toward the blood mage's neck. There was a flash of green light, and Leah was sent flying into a crowd of kindred soldiers who were moving to engage the Imperial force. The blood mage, still anchored to the earth, the source of its strength through the demon it rode, could not be touched, except with... The prince's hand flew to his sword, and he swung it in a wide, single arc that caused it to bite deeply into the earth demon's tree-trunk leg. There was a howl of pain that made the ground shake. The creature tried to stamp him out with its other foot, but with the speed of numerous men joined to his own, the prince was able to spin away and strike again with the Valyrian blade, the white metal cutting through the magic flesh. There was another scream of pain, and the creature brought down its iron mace with such strength that it left a crater in the ground. Rangers appeared, now led by Lorna, and engaged the demon with long spears, prodding the creature and unbalancing it enough that it turned its attention to them, leaving the prince alone. He turned, searching frantically through the crowd for Thomas and Ramael. Everything was chaos. The kindred and imperial armies were fighting with a ferocity that brooked no mercy. And in the center of it all, standing head and shoulders above every other man and woman there, were 2 giants. Thomas and Ramael were fighting so ferociously that even in the heat of the battle between exiles and imperials, a circle had opened up around them that no one dared to enter. Thomas's greatsword and Ramael's double-bladed axes were both flying so quickly and with such deadly power that sparks flew each time the blades hit, metal screeching against metal. The 2 were perfectly matched for battle, neither appearing able to gain any ground on the other. The Prince of Oxen's face was set in a snarling rictus of surprised fury, and Thomas's was set in a grimace somewhere between anger and pride. But fear seized the prince's heart. He began to push and kick and fight his way through the crowd, coming nearer and nearer to the 2 circling figures. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Leah manage to get to her feet and begin to do the same. The Prince of Oxen began to win. It was slight at first, seemingly just a minor setback on Thomas's part. But then it became more distinct. The Prince of Oxen began to move faster, faster than should have been possible, and the expression on his face turned to one of amusement as Thomas tried to counter attacks that seemed to come from every direction at once. Ramael's blows, which had been earth-shakingly powerful to begin with, now took on a power that was simply inhuman, and Thomas's arms began to shake with the effort of fending him off. The axes forced Thomas back, and then the Ashandel slipped on the slick footing of the blood-soaked stones and fell to one knee. The axes descended, and, just as in the prince's dream, Thomas crumbled. "No!" Leah ran at the Prince of Oxen, but 3 other Eshendai grabbed her and pulled her back, just as the earth demon swung its enormous mace and smashed a hole in the ground where she would have been. The prince fell to his knees, his whole body numb. Ramael let out a bellow of triumph and then turned and began to make his way back up the boulevard, cutting down anyone and anything that stood in his path. With a cry of anguish, the prince crawled the final few feet to where Tamaz lay. The big man's breathing was labored, but he was attempting to speak. He motioned the prince closer, and so the prince leaned in. "Kill me," Tamaz said in the prince's ear. The prince recoiled in shock, but what little strength remained in the great hulking body was enough to easily hold the prince's arm and keep him close. "I'm dying," Tamaz said. He coughed, and blood came to his lips. "You can recover," the prince said. "You can." "I don't want to recover in a world where there are no kindred," Tamaz responded, with a simple, earnest pride that made the prince's heart ache. Look at that man!" His rumbling voice had been reduced to a croaked whisper. The prince looked, and he saw Ramael sauntering down the broad avenue, killing all who dared to cross his path. He was laughing now, and he swung his axes with the indolent arrogance of a spoiled child cutting the heads off of poppies. "You can stop him," Tamaz said, tears coming to his eyes with the effort of speaking. "You can stop him." With a grunt of effort, the big man forced the Valyrium sword, discarded and lying on the ground, back into the prince's hands, placing the point above his heart. "Do it," he said harshly. The prince raised the sword over his head. "No, find another way. There has to be another way." Tamaz's eyes begged him to do it. The prince's hands shook. How can I find another way?" "Please," Tamaz said. The sword plunged down, and Tamaz died. Strength flooded his limbs, strength and power like the prince had never felt before. Tamaz by himself seemed to be as strong as 10 men. His heart began to beat so quickly that he felt certain it could be seen through his chest. The wounds he had sustained in the prolonged battle ceased to exist. The hole in the side of his chest from the arrow felt no more serious than a flea bite. Where seconds ago he had felt too weak to stand, he now felt as though he would never need to rest again. The memories came as well, but the prince pushed them immediately to the back of his mind. All of the memories except for the blade master training and his own rage at Tamaz's death. He would need that now. "Ramael!" The Prince of Oxen stopped and turned slowly to see the Prince of Ravens, unsheathed Valyrium sword in hand, standing over the now lifeless form of Tamaz. Ramael began to slowly walk back, ignoring the chaos of battle that surrounded him. 2 men crossed his path, but black and red axes flashed, and they were no more. The prince's hand was clutching the hilt of his sword in a cramped fist, his entire body throbbing with energy and life. The task of killing Ramael was impossible, but he had to try. For Tamaz, for the only true friend he had ever had, he would die trying. Ramael stopped. "You called, little brother?" "There's something we need to talk about," the prince said. Ramael chuckled and raised his axes. "Whatever could that be?" With a snarl of rage, the Prince of Ravens charged. His speed and strength carried him across the intervening distance in the blink of an eye, and Ramael barely had time to bring his axes up to deflect the Valyrium blade. They exchanged a series of blows, the prince moving through the blade master forms so quickly he barely had time to think. His sword was a white blur, but, unfortunately, so too were his brother's battle axes. Every thrust was parried, every riposte turned aside. The prince felt sweat break out all over his body, but his speed never flagged. Something flashed past his cheek, and he was forced to disengage. Another arrow shot toward him, and he had just enough time to dodge to the side. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his brother swing one of the axes, and with a desperate leap, the prince jumped to safety through an open doorway, just as more arrows hit the ground where he had been standing. I need to get him away from the battle, he realized. That much was clear. He had no chance of defeating his brother when he couldn't give his full attention to the task. He took a deep breath and shot off across the road, directly at the Imperial archers that had been firing at him. In 3 quick motions he cut them down, but saw more soldiers making their way forward. "Why, little brother," Ramael said, "have you been killing? I seem to remember how pathetically against that you were." The prince turned back. "Why do you ask, brother? Are you afraid of what I can do?" Anger crossed Ramael's face, and he brought the axes crashing down again. The prince managed to dodge away, but had to use all of his speed to do so. "What was that, Ramael?" he taunted. "I almost had time to take a nap during that swing." The first axe slashed through the air so quickly it was no more than a blur of motion that the prince just managed to avoid. "That's all you can do, big brother? Now I remember why I never looked up to you." Ramael let out a snarl of rage, swinging the second axe. Another miss. "You miserable, nameless wretch! I could tear you to pieces with one hand." "Do you really think you could even manage to lay a single finger on me?" Ramael lunged, but the prince was gone, racing up the street away from the battle. He looked over his shoulder and saw that Ramael was following him. Great, now he's chasing me. Was this really a good plan? The prince took a running leap, pushed off a wall with his enhanced strength, and landed like a cat on the roof of a house. There was a rumbling sound, and he looked down to see his brother pulling himself up the side of the house, tearing chunks of brick and mortar out of the wall with his gauntleted hands. The prince took off running along the top of the building, then jumped from roof to roof as fast as his feet could carry him. There came a heavy crash behind him, and he shot a look over his shoulder. His brother had made it to the rooftop and was still following him, leaving deep gouges in the wood and stone with his enormous weight, gaining ground with each of his immense strides. "Is that all you can do?" the prince called back, doubling his speed, leaping almost 10 feet with every step. The only answer he received was a roar of rage. Ramael picked up his pace as well, and soon he was right behind the prince. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" A battle axe swung down and tore into a section of rooftop where the prince had been not seconds before. The second axe swung and actually brushed the prince's head, shaving off a chunk of his hair and missing his scalp by the barest fraction of an inch. He rolled under his brother's feet and dove through an open doorway that led down a staircase to the main level of the house. With a crash of smashed plaster and powdered stone, Ramael tore through the opening and followed. Where do I take him? Where do I take him? Where do I... The prince made it out onto the main level of the street, looked left and then right, and saw off in the distance a large building that looked like a temple, up on the third tier of the city. Amon's temple, Tomaz had said in the pass of Khartoum. It was completely away from the battle, in an open area where he could face his brother alone. He took off running with all of Tomaz's strength, shadows and light, Tomaz, fueling his legs. And just in time, as the next instant his brother crashed down behind him with a bellow of rage. "Stop running!" That was all the encouragement he needed to run faster. He lowered his head and focused with all of his might on getting to the temple. He spun around a corner, going so fast that he overshot and ended up running along a wall for a few paces before being pulled back down to earth. He shot a look over his shoulder and saw that his brother, going just as quickly, couldn't help but smash into the wall, and was forced to extricate himself before he could continue the pursuit. It cost him barely a second, but it was enough that it gave the prince an idea. He kept running along the street, and his brother came up behind him alarmingly fast. He swerved again around a corner, and when his brother followed, he crashed into the opposite wall once more. The prince shot around another hairpin turn, but this time his brother checked his speed just in time to keep his distance. The gap between them narrowed. The prince looked up and saw his destination behind the large gate of the third tier, which was still open in the event the kindred needed to retreat. He flew through the opening and veered immediately to his left, where rose before him a wall of the large temple. He ran toward it with all of his might, casting frightened looks over his shoulder. Ramael followed, and, seeing his fear, let out a snarl and began to gain once more. The wall was coming closer. Closer. There! At the last moment, the prince turned and ducked away. With a resounding crash, Ramael shot past him and straight through the side of the building. As the dust settled, the prince followed, sword drawn and ready to fight. They were in a dark rectangular enclosure with unlit torches lining the walls. Dozens of pillars went from floor to ceiling, and in the middle of the room was a large marble tomb. All right, now I'm here. What do I do? He looked left and right, but his brother was nowhere to be found. How did someone run through a wall and then have the clarity of mind to hide? His nose wrinkled. He smelled blood and sweat and oiled metal. He dropped to the floor immediately and once again felt the heavy wind of a battle axe pass over his head, inches from beheading him. He rolled behind a pillar, got to his feet, and ran for the other side of the temple. With a resounding boom amplified by the large empty space, the Prince of Oxen swung his axes and destroyed the pillar in a shocking display of raw power. As the dust settled, Ramael stepped into view, swinging his axes easily by his sides, a horrible grin on his face. How do I defeat that? The prince thought in despair. The building around them seemed to shake for a minute, and then it settled. The prince's breath caught in his chest, and he realized he'd found the answer. Praying he'd be able to avoid his brother long enough to make the plan work, he ran toward another pillar. Ramael followed, and as soon as the prince was behind the pillar, Ramael tore it down with another savage blow that struck sparks as the metal of his blades tore through the heavy stone, ripping it to pieces. As the dust settled, Ramael looked around and saw nothing. The prince had taken the opportunity of his brother's momentary blindness and the enormous crash of the crumbling pillar to run to the other side of the temple and throw himself behind yet another pillar to hide. "Brother, brother, brother," Ramael said, amusement coloring his voice. "Are you hiding? No wonder Mother is so disappointed in you." The prince clenched his hands, and he forced out a slow, shaky breath. "Did you know that there was a bet between the children over which of us would be the one to bring you home? Though I suppose credit should be given where credit is due. Mother was the one who offered the prize for your head." There was another huge crash and the sound of screeching metal as Ramael tore down yet another pillar. The roof above them shook ominously, and a patch of stone ceiling crashed to the floor. The prince tensed, but the dust settled, and the building remained standing. The Ox Lord continued. "My bet was on Joffred, to be frank. He seemed to think it would take cunning to find you. But I always found you so predictable. At first I thought you were being clever, luring me into the exiled lands, trying to buy back your place in the children with the end of the exiles. Who knows? It might have worked. But when the Blood Mages told me you had moved, I knew you had gone over. I knew you had been corrupted away from your duty and your blood. Scum. Rebels. The worst dregs of humanity." "They are better than you will ever be!" The words were out before he could stop them. He snapped his mouth closed and held very still. Ramael began to walk slowly in his direction. "Ah, you actually believe you're doing the right thing, don't you? Think again, little one. You've betrayed your family. You've betrayed your Empress." "She betrayed me!" the prince shouted, coming out from behind the pillar before he could stop himself, rage boiling so hot that he couldn't see straight. "You all did. You tried to have me killed. You took away my name, you sent me into exile, and then you tell me I'm the traitor?" He charged, all rational thought gone. There was a furious exchange of blows that threw sparks into the dark temple. Ramael made another swing with his axe. The prince ducked, and it hit another pillar, which came crashing down. "Too slow," the prince taunted. His rage was so intense that it bordered on madness, but he could not pull back. Ramael reversed the swing and almost took the prince's head off. The prince had to scramble back ungracefully, and as he rolled back to his feet, his brother was laughing. It was then that he realized Ramael had been toying with him. "Is this all about Mother taking away your name?" Ramael asked. "Poor little boy. Would you like a new one? I'm sure I could think of something." "I have no name, and you have no right to give me one." He launched himself forward, sword light as a feather in his hands, and pushed his brother back across the room. A sharp swing from one of the axes brushed across the prince's ribs so closely that he knew he had barely avoided evisceration. The Valyrian sword lanced out again, but the axes were there to meet it and repel it. The prince dodged away, and the axe hit another of the pillars. And, finally, as this pillar crumpled, the entire temple, weakened to the point of collapse, came crashing down. The prince dove to the ground and covered his head with his hands as an enormous rumble vibrated through his body, and then he was struck with falling rocks. He cried out in pain as a stone smashed into his spine, and he felt his hands go numb and his vision grow dark. If it hadn't been for Tomaz's strength keeping his body whole beyond the point of natural endurance, he was certain that he would have been crushed to death. The shaking and crashing subsided. After a few moments of ringing silence, he managed to shift some of the rubble and began to pull himself out of the pile with one hand. His head emerged first, and he was able to get his second hand free. He then drew in a gasping, shuddering breath and set about pulling the rest of himself out, dirt and powdered stone clouding the air and making it impossible to see. Blood was in his eyes from a cut on his forehead, and his left arm was hanging uselessly by his side. His legs still seemed to work, but when he tried to stand, his strength finally failed him, and he slumped back to the ground. His sword was gone. He looked around for it frantically and saw it sticking out of the rubble several yards away. He began to crawl toward it, watching for any sign of his brother. The entire building had collapsed, and there were mounds of broken stone everywhere. Suddenly, a huge pile of rubble not far off to his left shifted and then seemed to explode outward. Romeo stood up with a bellow of contemptuous rage, whole pieces of armor missing and a wide, bloody gash marring his perfect face. His helm was gone, his breastplate torn away, and one of his axes was lost, buried somewhere deep in the temple's ruins. "Nothing can stop me, little brother," he said, "and now it is time to end this." The prince pulled himself with all the strength left to him toward the sword. It was only an arm's length away now. He reached for it, lunged for it, and his fingers just brushed the wire-wrapped hilt. "Too late for that," Romeo said. A double-bladed axe rose high overhead. And then a flash of steel shot through the air and sank into the Prince of Oxen's neck. Romeo let out a bellow of pain, and as the axe fell it went wide, burying itself in the ground next to the prince. Another dagger streaked through the air, sinking its foot-long blade into Romeo's back and causing another convulsion that made him fall to the ground. The prince pulled himself the last few inches, wrapped his hand around the hilt of the Valyrian sword, pulled it from the rubble, and with a cry of pain at the effort, sank the blade into his brother's chest, piercing Romeo's heart. Light exploded in the prince's mind, as his brother's life and memories were added to his own. His mind felt as though it had been exposed to the sun after being kept for 17 years in the dark. 142 years of memories, crystal clear and visceral, flooded into him. He began to shake. Darkness fell in around him. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear, he couldn't... Someone slapped him across the face. "Ah!" He sat upright, holding his head with both of his hands. "Are you all right?" Leah asked. "Parchment," he said. "Get me parchment and something to write with." The memories of the Prince of Oxen were whirling through his mind, more than he had ever absorbed before, and he knew he would not be able to contain it all. In any other case, he was sure his body would have collapsed under the strain, but he felt now as if he had an unlimited source of strength that he could draw on, a power like the sun that would never die, and it held him together. He wasn't sure when the parchment came. He wasn't even quite sure how he was able to write legibly, but he was later told that he wrote for the better part of an hour and never the same sentence twice. Memory by memory, the prince plumbed the depths of his brother's mind, doing his best not to think of what he was writing down, just putting it into words. He would deal with it all later. He had no time to judge it now, and he couldn't keep it in his mind. The memories were on all topics, but among the most important were details about the layout of the castle of Rourke, the defenses of the Empire, the current state of Empire politics, and the names of various spies planted within the kindred's forces. And then, without warning, the memories from his brother's mind shifted, and the prince was suddenly remembering another life. The life of a young boy, training with a sword bigger than any the prince had ever seen. Tomaz. The next thing he knew, he was up and running, still clutching the Valyrian sword in his hand. He left the ruins of the once great temple and moved in a strange, dreamlike trance through the city, memories playing in his mind of the giant who had given his life to save the kindred. He moved through the gate to the second tier of the city, passing cheering kindred, hearing the sound of retreat blown on imperial horns. But none of that seemed to matter. He turned a corner, and there he was, lying where the prince had left him. Tomaz. He moved to the big man's side. He sank to the ground beside the body, feeling the rough stone of the street scrape his knees through his tattered clothing. How could Tomaz be dead? The prince felt as though at any second the big man would roll over, rise to his feet, and laughingly ask the prince what he was doing on the ground. Tomaz, I'm sorry, he said, voice full of emotion. He laid one hand on the gaping axe wound left by the Prince of Oxen. He began to sob. The memories of Tomas's life continued to play in his mind. Guardian training, a young woman, long ago, hope and laughter and simple things. And then the memories began to fade. In a panic, the prince tried to hold on to them, to keep them from leaving, but the harder he tried, the more quickly they seemed to fade. He let out a growl of frustration. He wouldn't let what was left of Tomas die. He would keep these memories. He would keep Tomas alive. Concentrating with all of his might, he sank mental anchors into the memories and began to reel them back toward him. Memories of guardian training, memories of the girl from his youth, the parents he had never known, and a man he had been forced to kill. The Empress condemning him, the pain he'd felt as his name had been stripped from him, torn from him, and the first sight of the prince, and the knowledge, the certainty that he could be redeemed, that both of them could be redeemed. But the memories continued to fade, like lines drawn in sand before an advancing tide, and the power of the big man's life began to fade as well. Dimming, dying. So the prince drew on what strength he had, drew as much strength and power and energy as he could find in his body and threw it into the memories, clinging to Tomas and sobbing over his body. A burst of light flung the prince flat on his back, and the memories were suddenly sucked away from him by an inexorable force. And then the strength that had kept him going, the strength he'd taken from his brother's death, was gone as well, and he fell backward into darkness.